Welcome, everybody. Today we examine Mayor-elect deBlasio's lesser-known weapon against inequality, after school. He wants it available free to every middle schooler in New York City. Then, in our public intellectual segment, which looks at research with the power to change our minds and public policy, we hear about yet another consequence of grinding poverty: poor decision-making. Later on, we get answers to retail questions such as, will teens continue to hang out and shop at the mall when they can hang out and shop online? Finally, in this hour together, we'll see how gaming and reading are converging into interactive digital fiction. But first, did you notice that during his campaign for mayor, Bill de Blasio was pushing not just for universal pre-kindergarten, but free after-school programs for the city's 120,000 middle schoolers? Well, he has been, and here's his argument.
Few areas of government have seen as much in the way of cutbacks as after school. We have lost 30,000 seats, 30,000 after-school seats a year in this city since the year 2008. So we have 30,000 fewer seats available to our children today than we had in 2008. According to the After School Alliance, nearly 1 in 4 kids in this city is left alone and unsupervised once school ends. And of course, almost a half of the city's families are single-parent households. So the need is profound, and what we have done in recent years in government, unfortunately, has taken us in the wrong direction. Now, you look at the result of kids not having a place to go after school, not having programming, not having support. You know, California did a study. The California Juvenile Crime Prevention Demonstration Project found that after-school programs successfully reduced juvenile violence. They looked at 12 high-risk communities, and they found that the likelihood of teens carrying a concealed weapon and the likelihood of youth arrests were reduced by half.
Mayor-elect de Blasio at the recent Summit on Children. By the way, to see that full keynote speech and a panel that I hosted there, go to CUNY.tv to watch our December 4th, 2013 program. So what defines quality after school? Attendance is voluntary. How do such programs keep kids engaged after a long day in regular classes? Joining us, Nora Nagelski-Eichner, Executive Director of the New York State After School Network, and Diana Torres, Division Director of Good Shepherd Services After School Programs in the Bronx. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Nora, many people think, oh, after school, that's just daycare, so the kids can have someplace to be until the parents come home from work. Is it much more than that?
It is actually so much more than that, and I think that misconception has thrown a lot of people. And the last several decades, after-school programs have really worked hard to set the bar much higher. They certainly are likely to provide homework help. It's sort of a core activity to keep the kids connected to school and reinforce what they're learning in the school day. But they're going to go on to do enrichment activities from robotics to poetry slams. They're going to think about how the kids are getting a healthy meal, in many cases hot supper, in fact. Then they're going to really strive to push them to be a little bit more healthier, to exercise, play a sport, and really develop their social and emotional skills. I think that it's hard to underestimate how much it matters that students have a safe adult to talk to and really build a mentoring relationship with. And that's one of the things after-school programs really provide. And
I think that they're tying this in the argument for the funding that they're going to be seeking from Albany to graduation rates, that's one of the things that ultimately leads to higher graduation rates for students who are currently in middle schools, these after-school programs. And yet again, to many people watching, it'll seem so indirect, so peripheral. What's your case?
The case is that when they come to these programs, they are learning. They're learning through the activities that they're doing. We want to make it different from school. But also giving them opportunities to read, to build vocabulary, to feel good about themselves, to learn how to negotiate relationships, to think deeper about different things. So the way we do this is getting them to having choices for them that are to their interests. And they're surveyed, they're assessed, and asked, what do you want? You know, what would you like? And you try to create these activities that they will be able to choose from. They try them all out, and then get to pick them, and that's where we really go for the interest.
And I was just going to say what the research really says then about the high school graduation is that exactly what Diana's saying, by giving them choices, by getting them engaged, they start showing up at school more regularly. Their school day attendance increases. Their behavior problems decrease. They start learning more when they're actually in the classroom, and that actually can then build over the course of several years into really making a difference to help them stay in school.
Tell me more about how it's different from school and how you get the kids, because these are voluntary. These middle schoolers, you know, 13, 14-year-olds, they can go out and hang out. Nobody's going to force them to stay in the building, I think. So how is it really different from school, and how do you keep them engaged?
Well, first of all, we find out what the school has, what the gaps are, what the school is not offering. And really work with the schools, and especially the principal, to see what they would like also for their young people to have. And so a lot of the times it's sports, big draw, and the arts. That's where we see the biggest gaps. And they really love the dancing, the salsa, or martial arts. They have opportunities to play with each other, compete against each other, and to perform.
Tell me more about the programs that Good Shepherd provides. What schools are you in? What part of the Bronx is this? What's the best part?
We're in the Fordham, Belmont, Tremont, University Heights section of the Bronx. We have one high school program in the Soundview area and the Stevenson campus. All of the programs are school-based, and the best part, what really works, is I think the arts. They love the arts, and we really see it. I was sharing with Nora about the salsa program. When you come up with something with curriculum, we really look for really good curriculum that has really good beginning, middles, and endings, that is scaffolded and sequenced, and then the staff get really well trained on it. That's where you see really the high level of engagement, a trained staff, a really intentional curriculum.
So take the number 4 train to Fordham Road at 3:30 in the afternoon on a weekday and go to the nearest school, and we're going to see your programs in operation.
Yes.
What is the unmet need? We heard in the clip the mayor-elect talking about 30,000 slots cut since 2008. So if he's looking for universal after school for middle school students in the city, how close are we to that now?
We're a long way from it now. We have about a quarter of New York City's students participate in some kind of after-school program, and that's based actually on the same survey that found that a quarter of our students are also going home alone, which is the really scary part. But that quarter may include kids who are getting, 1 day or 2 days a week, not really the opportunity to have everything that would get them the homework help, plus the salsa lessons, plus the chance to, practice on a sports team and maybe learn some French.
So this is so many kids, because his number was 120,000.
Yeah, for the middle schoolers.
Would be total middle schoolers, right?
Yep. Yep.
And if it's a quarter of that, then 30,000 are getting them. 90,000 kids.
Roughly, yeah.
That's a lot of unmet need, and that's a lot of slots to create. Expensive then, right?
It is, but one would argue, I think, that it's far less expensive than a lot of the consequences. We know that kids who drop out of high school are very unlikely to become particularly productive taxpayers in the long run. We know that they're increasingly likely to be involved in the juvenile justice or the adult justice system. If you think about the fact that to keep one child in placement upstate for a year, it's around $250,000. We could run an after-school program that could serve 100 kids, maybe more, for that amount of money. So there is a real return on investment that I think, people like deBlasio really are looking at as a long-term gain for the city.
So how would you expand it? Would you send more money to more independent programs like Good Shepherd that work in various schools, or to the schools themselves and say, look, this is going to be just a core service that we provide in every building? Is there a mechanism?
I think that what a lot of people will look at is the kind of school community partnership that Good Shepherd offers. The Out of School Time program, which is run by the Department of Community and Youth Development here in New York City, has been an investment of the City Council and of Mayor Bloomberg over the last several years. And those really are based on the school community partnership model, which really, again, takes this idea that schools are going to have gaps by the nature of their funding sources, by the nature of who's in the school and what their strengths are, and that bringing a community provider who has that local connection, those additional ideas and resources, can really help create a program that is going to engage students differently than the school day.
So how do you count? Go ahead. You want to
Yeah.
add something? Go ahead.
There are a lot of resources too that also come together, and I think really, the key part is the partnerships, because the Department of Education is also seeing the importance of the expanding the school day. So they're putting in, resources through their middle school extra program, and then there's the 21st Century program, and then there's Good Shepherd and OST and Department of Youth Community Development, and all these things, all these programs integrating together, taking the school's resources and these other resources, is where I think we're really working at maximizing.
And how do you explain the fact that there's so much interest recently? The Department of Education, as you say, getting more interested in this under Bloomberg, plus the mayor-elect putting it right at the top of his priority list. Why now?
Well, I'm hoping that it's because there's more funds, because I feel people have seen that there's a need there. There's been efforts at investment, over the years. But hopefully that the funds there, whoever's the powers that be are seeing that it is very important, especially that the connections are being made. We're seeing it now in the research regarding where the gaps are and where it's happening. That we've caught that, young people who are not on grade level, by the time they're in grade, they have less of a chance of graduating from high school. That's compelling.
It is. And I think the Common Core actually is also driving a lot of this as well. If you look at what
That's
this sort
the
of
new curriculum standards really being driven by Washington for the whole nation that are supposed to be improvements in the way teaching takes place.
Right. But what I'll actually say is that they're not really being driven by Washington so much as they actually came out of the business community. I mean, they started as this idea of what business leaders were telling governors they needed their students to be able to do to succeed in a global workforce. So it's this idea that, to succeed as an employee in the future, we're going to need students who can think critically, who can make the connections between something they learned in school and what it actually means in the real world. And that's going to push us to teach in a way that's much more hands-on, experiential. And that's what after school is really strong at. We've done a lot in those regards in the last few years, and so I think people are interested in learning about that.
I didn't realize it was driven by the business community. So in addition to these critical thinking skills, they're going to be trained not to ask for too much money from their employers, right?
Or we hope that they're actually learning negotiating skills and will push back in a good sort of way on that.
There you go. With Police Commissioner Bratton having just been designated, of course, Mayor-elect deBlasio is going to want to make sure crime stays down and keeps going down. Is this also seen as an anti-crime measure? Because we know there's a lot of crime in the after-school hours, or don't you like to look at it that way?
Well, we know that that's a time that young people have high-risk behaviors, and that when they're alone, they're going to try. They're exploring, so we want to give them other places to do that.
What's the price tag, and are you competing against pre-K, even though the mayor-elect likes to put these together as the two essential building blocks?
We're absolutely not competing. I think actually it's incredibly important to say over and over again that both have to work in tandem. Again, the research on this is really clear. Early learning matters enormously. We need to get kids engaged soon. We need to get them with rich vocabularies before they even start school. But then we need the after-school piece to really reinforce all of that. The achievement gap is cumulative. You see bits of loss year after year after year, and that's really what adds up. So we need those interventions both at the beginning and all the way through. And I think the communities are working really closely together. The Campaign for Children here in the city has been very much a joint effort, and we see that continuing at the state level. We think that they are essential partners. And
so politics, do you think the state legislature is going to approve this little tax hike on people making more than $500,000 a year in the city that the mayor-elect says he needs in order to make this a reality?
I have done this long enough that I'm not going to make any predictions about anything, but I will say that we are incredibly lucky. We now have a mayor-elect who is very committed to after school, working with a governor who has already shown his commitment to after school. Last year, he invested in both community schools and extended learning time pilot programs that are available statewide, a competitive RFP. That was a huge investment of new money at a time when there weren't many new investments. So we know the governor really understands the importance of these kind of services. He invested in pre-K as well. And we're looking forward to seeing the two of them negotiate to make something happen for all of our students.
All right. Well, thank you both very much for coming in. Good luck. Time now for this week's Public Intellectual, our series which takes a look at new research that has the power to change our minds and public policy. According to our next guest, when money is a serious problem in our lives, it not only affects how we live, it affects how we think. He and his colleagues have found that as poverty's many financial challenges accumulate, decision-making gets worse, including, ironically, decisions about money. Princeton psychology and public affairs professor Eldar Shafir is the author of Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much. Welcome to our program.
Thank you.
What motivated you to look at the behavioral economics of poverty in this respect?
I was doing research on decision making for years, and I had a very good friend and colleague who was doing developmental economics in the third world and developing countries. And one day over lunch, we realized that nobody was really focusing on the decision making that the poor make in the context of poverty, and decided to make it our agenda, our project.
So let's look at the results of your project with the aid of some visuals. These are charts that we're going to show, some graphics from the book. So why don't you just walk us through these? Walk us through this one first.
Well, our story in general is that when you inhabit a context of scarcity, in this case poverty, you spend a lot of time focusing on that, and you do a remarkably good job thinking about the nuances of how to budget your limited resources. So what we show here, among other things, is when you ask people both in the US and developing countries, what do you think about when you buy something? We show that the poor, those who have limited resources, think much more than the rich about what they might not be able to buy instead. So trade-off thinking, which turns out to occupy a lot of our mind, a lot of our cognitive capacity, emerges as something that the poor spend a lot more time thinking about than the rich.
So on the chart on the left, you're comparing a TV versus a toaster.
No, comparing the blue versus the red, so the low income versus the high income participants, on when they think about things such as toasters, TVs, and mixers in the case of India. And in all these cases, when they think about buying an appliance,
Yes.
the poor report thinking about what they might not be able to buy instead much more often, twice as often as the rich.
So, and let's bring it back to the studio and talk about this graphic before we go on to some other ones. Are you suggesting that poor people will tend to make less strategic choices for the long term because they're thinking about what something's going to cost versus what something else that they can't get is going to cost at the moment?
Well, what we're saying is that the poor spend a lot of time thinking on moment-to-moment decisions they need to make, and they do those very well. The other part of the graph on the right we didn't speak about was about asking them how much does a meter in a taxi cost when you enter a cab in Boston. We stand in South Station in Boston.
And they say, we don't know, we can't afford cabs.
That's what's so interesting. They take cabs less often than the rich,
Yes.
but they're 3 times more likely to know what the meter shows than the rich. The rich walk in, couldn't care less, don't spend any cognitive time on that question. The poor attend to how much the meter shows. So what we're finding is that the poor spend a lot of time thinking very carefully about trade-offs, about prices. They do that very well.
So that's a good thing, but
Very
then you
good
tell us that there's a cost to
Exactly.
that.
As
What?
they're focusing on this thing, on managing, juggling their budget, they're tunneling on it, and everything in the periphery loses focus. You attend much less to everything else, to taking your medications on time, to reading to your children after school, to banking correctly, to paying your checks on time. All that's in the periphery while you're paradoxically focusing very well, using your dollar better than the rich do, on managing the day-to-day juggling.
All right, so let's put up slide number 2 and see another data graphic here. And we're going to call this Scarcity Creates Distraction.
This is, we're moving now from money for a moment to dieting. Turns out that scarcity doesn't have to be only in dollars, it could be in calories as well. Here what we're doing is looking at dieters versus non-dieters and how long it takes them to find words in a word search game. And what we're doing is comparing how long it takes you to find the common neutral words, the even number words, tree, cloud, lamp, etc. in the 2 conditions. And what the graphs show on the left, the non-dieters take equally long to find the words independently of whether they appear with distracting words that are about food, like cake and donut and sweets. Whereas if you look at the dieters on the right, they, when they look for the word, for example, cloud, take twice as long to find the cloud when it's preceded by a donut than when it's preceded by a neutral word. So
In
having
other
seen
words,
donuts,
if you're hungry, if you have food issues, you're going to be more easily distracted by references to food.
once you see a donut, it impacts how well you can do the next thing.
And is this a problem in real life? This was an experiment having to do with a word search. So
Among dieters, that's right.
among dieters and non-dieters. So other than playing Sudoku on the subway, how does this affect people in real
Well,
life?
it turns out dieters are distracted by counting calories and dieting. And what we find is that the poor are distracted by juggling their finances and doing things, moment to moment as best they can. And there's a lot of work on people who are hungry. There's very touching experiments in the 40s. When the Allied forces discovered they were about to inherit hungry people in Europe, they did research on how to feed people, and they got volunteers to starve not to death, but to great discomfort. And what these found is these guys, talented young men, can't think of anything but food. They plan to open restaurants, they read recipes. It interferes with everything else they're trying to do.
And so you did a correlation as part of this between food stamps and school behavior?
There's a lot of research that we did not do on how kids get disciplinary, for example, problems in schools if they're in families that receive food stamps as the month runs out, as compared to other kids in the same class who are not kids of food stamp recipients who don't show these effects.
All right, next graphic. Poverty impedes cognitive function.
Yes, it came out a little bit dirty there, but in any case, the main issue here is we go to people in a mall in New Jersey, ask them to volunteer.
And that's the background shot. It's a little hard to tell, but it's a mall. I believe that's an American Children's Place on the right and a Victoria's Secret on the left, which is a little weird that they're right across the street from each other, but that's another show.
We didn't do that part. And we asked them to volunteer to be in the study, and we present them the financial scenarios. Some of them are easy, they're manageable. The car is going to cost you $150 to fix. And others, the hard ones, the expensive, the challenging scenarios, have a case where the car breaks down, it's going to cost you $1,500 to fix, which we know for low-income people in the mall is a real challenge.
So the easy scenarios are represented by the green.
The green and the
bars.
orange are the challenging scenarios that are much more expensive.
Okay, and what are
Then we divide the left and the right within the same graph. So the two leftmost bars are the rich, and what you see is their performance on these cognitive control tasks. These are tasks that manage to test your ability to divide attention, or in the case of the right, Raven's matrices are a classic component of IQ testing. They're about fluid intelligence. What we show is that the rich people, whether they're thinking about the cheap or the expensive car, do just as well on better attention, on an IQ. The poor, when they're preoccupied by the easy to finance car, look indistinguishable from the rich. They do just as well. But when they're preoccupied by a car that's challenging to them, they now do much less well on cognitive control. They basically drive less attentively, and they lose a lot of IQ points on the fluid intelligence. The effect there compares to losing about 13 IQ points.
So really, all of these slides are showing us different details around the same basic idea, which is that if you are focused on getting by day to day, then it's harder to engage other parts of your brain to get other things done effectively.
Indeed. And the one thing they add, which is very important for the long-standing 3-decade worth of debate about the poor, is that if you put them in conditions where the poverty does not impinge on your mind, does not weigh on you too heavily, you're just as capable as your rich friends. It's the moment that the poverty impinges on you and draws your capacity that you perform less well.
And there's data regarding that? In other words, looking at the same people in different financial circumstances?
Indeed. I don't know if you have the graph here, but after we did this in the mall where everything was controlled, but you ought to be able to say, you say, look, the rich and the poor in America, after all, are different. We went to India and used sugarcane farmers. We use sugarcane farmers because the harvest, there it is, these are people who harvest sugarcane only once a year, and so the bulk of their income comes in one shot. Because they live, limited means, they basically fail to smooth. They run out of their money a little bit too early. So these are farmers who find themselves rich after the harvest and poor before. So we now run the same guys 4 months apart, 2 months before and 2 months after harvest when they're rich and when they're poor. And what these show you are reaction times and error rates. They're basically about 10 IQ points less smart before harvest than after. This is the same individual, same education, same everything.
So what does all this mean for public policy? What can we do?
Well, what it means is that as financial stresses impose themselves on the poor, they have less mind left for other things. And what we need to do is facilitate in any way we can the lives of the poor so that there's less mental capacity drawn by the day-to-day juggling and a bit more mind left to take care of your kids and your medications and your banking and everything else. And as it turns out right now, in the US especially, in other places too, but we're more extreme than Europe, we make the lives of the poor not easy. And there are many ways to look at it. I'll give you one funny example I just learned that's kind of striking. bank accounts in America deposit money in your account 5 days a week and withdraw 7. You know, every time you give and deposit a check, you know, one goes in, one doesn't, you pay a $35 penalty for bouncing a check by Monday. It makes juggling very difficult. It draws a lot of your attention. You have to spend a lot of time worrying about it. And so as you do all that, the data show, you just have less mind left for other things. And there are many ways to think about facilitating all that, not to mention childcare and transportation, where you just spend less time preoccupied and more time doing things you ought to do instead.
But does this solve the great debate that we seem to constantly have in Washington between, let's say, the current one over extended unemployment benefits for people who have been out of work for a long time, which the Republicans say will just leave people more dependent and less motivated to go out and look for, versus growth-oriented policies, so there are more jobs, more good-paying jobs to get more people out of policy that way? Is it completely irrelevant to that?
No, we want more jobs, we want higher pay, we want higher minimum wage, all that's absolutely, I fully support it, and it's a smart idea. Wherever we get, when we have those who are less fortunate, there's a reason, if you look at the impact that this limited bandwidth has on our capacity, no matter what else we do, there's a reason to worry about making their lives and their day-to-day management as manageable or as friendly as possible and as scarcity-proof, as failure-proof as possible, because they're bound to fail, they're bound to forget, they're bound to trip. And so if you design a context that helps them do those things better, having done everything else you can in terms of, you know, higher pay and more jobs, you will just increase their capacity, which we know is there, and make them succeed more.
Are you afraid at all that your work is going to be misinterpreted as blaming the poor, so that employers or other people who see this research might think, oh, well, this person is poor, therefore studies indicate that they're going to have less acute cognitive functioning because they're distracted by their poverty, and so maybe I'm not going to hire that person as quickly?
It was definitely a concern, and misreading of our work would lead you to that direction. But the fact is that this interpretation is so common that it was worth taking the risk, because if you read it a little bit more carefully, the finding is blindingly clear. That what we're finding is that the behaviors you see that are less than optimal are the behaviors not of poor people, but of people who you put in poor contexts. The farmers who are very capable when they're richer are less capable when they're poorer. So everything we're finding shows that it's the context of poverty that leads to bad decisions, not the poor person.
Have you gotten the pushback that says, if you make life more comfortable for the poor, then they're going to be too comfortable and too dependent on the handouts or wherever the money is coming from, and therefore not motivated to rise themselves up toward more independence?
That pushback, of course, is common. One hears it very often. Believe me, no matter what you do for the poor, their lives are still going to be uncomfortable enough that nobody's going to envy them. And from everything I see, and there's a lot of work on this, both ethnographic and interviews and every other measurement you can look at, that finds the poor in general, on the whole, being very attentive, very careful, very capable, trying the best they can, and struggling against very, very trying circumstances.
Last question. Why did you compare the U.S. and India? And even though we have some very high poverty in the United States, the last stat I heard is as much poverty in this country as before any of the War on Poverty Great Society programs in the 60s since the Great Recession, to compare to India, where poverty is, I think it's fair to say, at a whole other level of poor for so many people. What were you looking to find out?
So we weren't comparing the U.S. to India. We went to India because we wanted a case where we can find the same person being rich and poor, and that's not easy to do, and circumstances are such that in farming, in low-income farming, that's one case when you harvest once a year that gives you that construction. So India, in some sense, was an accident. You're absolutely right that there are different levels of poverty. Sometimes, you know, critics dismiss work on the American poor, saying, look, what are you talking about? Compared to India, they'd be middle class. But that really misses the point, and Adam Smith and others have written a lot of beautiful passages on this. If you're not able to live a minimally acceptable life in a place and time in which you are, then you're poor. Of course, you know, internet was a magnificent luxury 20 years ago, but if today, in today's world, the school assumes your kid has internet access, and your employer assumes you have a cell phone, and you don't have those things, well, then you're poor. And in some sense, not understanding that is part of the reason that leads to a certain lack of empathy about the poor that I think is misguided.
Thank you for sharing your research with us. Up next, the future of retail, city and suburb. In this gifting season of the year, Do you still shop till you drop, or sit in an armchair clicking the purchase button below the virtual shopping cart? Clearly, the web has caused a mutation in the retail gene. But how exactly is retail evolving? Will malls survive when teens can hang out online? How come brick and mortar space is still such a hot commodity in many places? Why are chain stores headed to Brooklyn? Adrienne Pasquarelli is on top of all this. She is a senior reporter at Crain's New York Business. Welcome to our program.
Thank you.
First, give us the short-term report. How did Black Friday do in the stores? How did Cyber Monday and what they've really called Cyber Week now do online?
Well, this year there were a lot of predictions about the holiday shopping season not going so well. We were talking about 2%, 3%, an uptick of 2% or 3%, and the Black Friday holiday weekend, the kickoff to shopping, it kind of proved some of those predictions correct. I think sales were down 3%, the first decline since 2009 for that period from Thanksgiving through the weekend. So Black Friday didn't do as well as expected. A lot of retailers opened early. We heard about Thanksgiving Day openings,
Right.
pushing up the promotions. The bright spot was the online sales. I think they were up something like double digits, not just for Cyber Monday, for the whole weekend. So online is shaping up to be a bright spot as usual for retail.
So let's talk about the future of malls. A Pew study that I have some stats here from said 3/4 of teens say they prefer brick and mortar stores and still want to go to the mall to shop and for movies. But we know teens can socialize online and order clothes from their phones or anywhere. So when it comes to hanging out in the mall, is it still the 1980s?
Yes, I don't think it's still the 1980s. We're not seeing a lot of that mall rats, which might have been the 90s. I don't know when that movie was.
80s, 90s.
But no, I mean, a lot of teens they're not hanging out in the malls like they used to. I know there is that study, but I think if teens were really hanging out in the malls, they'd be buying as well. And the sales of a lot of mall-based retailers, we're talking about those geared toward teens like Aeropostale, American Eagle, Abercrombie and Fitch. Those sales are not looking great, and they haven't been for a while. Since the spring, really, sales have been down. They were down for back to school over the summer and into the fall, and now for holiday, we're seeing that continue.
But all those chains have websites. So are the same teens buying the same clothes from the same retailers only online? Or for some reason, is their online behavior moving them away from those particular chains?
Well, I mean, the web only makes up it's still a smaller percentage of sales. So we're talking about like 12%, 14% maybe for some that is coming from online. And so even if teens are shopping online, it wouldn't make up such a big
So where are they going? They're
well,
just
they're not
less?
shopping
It's
as
just
much.
the economy is down, so they're not shopping as much?
They're just not. I think apparel sellers are really hard hit right now. It seems that a lot of Americans are spending on bigger ticket items like automobiles and houses, and some of those parents might not be giving teens as much of an allowance as in previous years. And then some of these teen retailers that are really mall focused are they had specialized in things like a logo on a T-shirt, and those aren't big trends anymore. Kids don't care about having Aeropostale emblazoned on their chest like they used to. There's no real driving force for a product this year. Nothing really a must-have. A few years ago it was skinny jeans. Everyone has skinny jeans now, so it's not. They just don't need anything new, and there's nothing that all their friends have like a cool product that they need. Maybe electronics.
Electronics.
Yeah,
Always,
so
right?
not apparel right now.
Right. Is the mall dying to some degree, partly because population trends are shifting, that there's more affluence in and around the cities, and so the suburbs where we think of mall culture just are not where it's at anymore for people who can afford to spend?
I think malls are on a decline because there were so many malls, because in the 80s and 90s, there were so many shopping centers, so many retailers opened stores here and there. They opened at a mall here and then a couple miles away, they'd be at a different mall, and there were just too many. And so a lot of these retailers are pulling back, they're closing their stores in the malls, and that's why we're seeing shopping centers decline and vacancies go up in the suburbs.
So what's happening in the city? I read a stat that I repeated as we were introducing the segment that big box stores, chain stores, are looking to Brooklyn out of the boroughs in New York City for a lot of growth right now. Is that your information?
Yeah, the city, retail in the city is, it's different from the suburbs. We kind of live in a bubble here in New York a little bit, in terms of we're a place where a lot of stores want to be. I mean, we have Fifth Avenue is filled with every retailer imaginable, and a lot of these stores ran out of space in Manhattan, and rents are very high, and they are going to some of the boroughs. Brooklyn especially, I think it was nearly 3% uptick in chain stores between this year and last year, which is in Brooklyn, which was the highest of any of the boroughs. I think Manhattan saw a small decline in chain stores.
What chain stores, for example?
Well, I mean, we're talking about chain stores like Dunkin' Donuts and Subway, and a lot of those that you see, you know,
Fast food.
exactly. But we're also seeing in Brooklyn, we're seeing J. Crew. I mean, Barney's came to Brooklyn a couple of years ago. Stephen Allen's over there. It's just a lot of those. Some of the chains like J. Crew are really thinking of Brooklyn as a viable option.
Is there an Apple store there yet? You know, Borough President Marty Markowitz has
Oh,
made
gosh.
this one of his crusades, bring an Apple store to Brooklyn.
Maybe not by the end of his time, but
Which is at the end of the year.
yeah.
And is Manhattan becoming, in a way, more of a design center rather than a garment center in the old sense of the garment district?
You mean in terms of the actual manufacturing of stores, of clothing? The old way of manufacturing clothing here locally in the garment center?
Well, I guess I mean, is the creative side of the industry still here? Does the Gap or Pick Your Chain still have a lot of their designers located in New York?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about the Gap specifically is they're based in San Francisco. They're not even headquartered here, and they opened a design office down in Tribeca a couple years ago for the first time. JCPenney just signed on for a very large design center. So what that means is that all the clothing is designed locally. It's not manufactured locally, but they come up with the design, you know, where to put the pocket and all that, what colors to use. That's all done here in the city, and Manhattan is becoming a real place for this creative energy from retailers. And I think Kohl's and Sears also have that same type of office here.
What's the reason for that, do you think? Out of all the places in America or the world where they could locate, maybe with cheaper rent?
Well, it's not the rent, but it's not the rent here. But I mean, New York is the fashion capital. We like to
capital.
boast that. And I mean, look at all the design schools, FIT and Parsons and LIM. They're all here, so that's where a lot of the talent is. And then there is New York Fashion Week, and we have all of that. So.
How about paper catalogs? Do they still have a life?
What's interesting about paper catalogs is you would think they wouldn't, because it is a step backwards and everything is moving online, but catalogs are still very much alive and well, and a lot of e-commerce companies are getting into sending out mail-and-order catalogs. I just got one from Bonobos, that men's retailer that sells only online. So they look at it as a way of showing their clothing in the setting that it's meant to be made for, whereas online you can only show, like, you kind of see a person in white space. You don't have a lot of room for that
There's just
setting.
something about it being more tactile and tangible
And
that they think sells it.
Right, and flipping through, I don't know, you take it with you on the subway to work, I guess. You're looking while you're on the L train, I don't know.
Have any companies tried to back off their catalogs and gotten in trouble and so brought them back?
Yeah, I mean, Land's End did, which, you know, obviously a big catalog, has a big catalog business, their only business. They tried to pull back in the late 90s. and it didn't work out so well for them, so they ramped it up again. And that's actually the only case I can think of where they have pulled back.
So for Mayor-elect deBlasio coming in, is he facing an era of less retail as a result of all of this, and therefore less tax revenue?
Well, I think some of the problems that we talked about earlier, those are not really happening here in New York. I think New York is still very vibrant. A lot of firms still want to be here. We're talking about putting a retail flag here, not just the offices of a creative hub of a company like Gap. A lot of companies, retailers, they have to have a presence in New York because we were getting so many tourists all the time. They really, for their brand, they need to have that New York.
So that's good news for New York. That's encouraging. And New York just survived a challenge to charging sales tax online for people from New York who shop online, a challenge at the Supreme Court. But New York does have the right to impose that sales tax. So maybe that's got big implications too.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You know it well, reading has gone digital. Touchscreen devices like Amazon's Kindle, Apple's iPad, and that smartphone in your pocket are putting serious pressure on traditional book publishers to feed the new technology. And not just with words. App developers like Sweden's Simogo and England's Inkle have blazed the trail to the new interactive fiction. But one old school publisher is not standing still. This past year, Random House teamed up with independent British gaming studio Fail Better Games to publish a text-based game called Black Crown. What does this new medium look like? What does this trend mean for lovers of the written word? Joining us, John Morgan. He is Director of Digital Publishing at Penguin USA. And linked in from London, Alexis Kennedy, Chief Narrative Officer at Fail Better Games. Welcome to both of you. Hi.
Hi.
So Alexis, what kind of a name is this for a game company? Fail Better.
Originally we were going to be called Buzzkill Games, but that didn't really take. Fail Better is a Beckett quote, actually. Ever tried, ever failed, try again, fail better. And it stuck.
Fail better after you try again. A good strategy for life, not just gaming. So John, text-based games, electronic literature, interactive fiction, all these titles, are these all the same thing?
There's really a giant range. I mean, I feel like you basically have two things. You have a book, which is kind of a narrative story that starts from the beginning, goes linearly to the end, and then you have a game, which is, you know, much more of a world that you explore and you have to make some changes, and all of this is kind of operating in between it, and it's a real question of how much of it is a game and how much of it is a story, and it's a giant spread.
Same question for you, Alexis.
It's a giant spread again. There's, I'd say, almost religious differences that apply between the distinctions between interactive fiction, choice-based fiction, electronic literature, cybertext, all these sort of things. And we're really still finding our way towards clear orientation points that allow us to distinguish between them. But the fundamental similarities are digital texts very often now store state about what you've done or what you're planning to do, and the choices you make while you navigate them affect the choices that are then presented to you and the experience you then have as you move on.
We're going to show an example.
Is this device 6?
Yes, device 6. What can you tell us about it, Alexis?
So device 6 is it's a beautiful piece of work. It's very clever. It's Simogo, Scandinavian developer. It's very playful. It's very tactile. It makes the most of being on a mobile device. So you're experiencing it through swiping and through navigating around it and through hearing sounds that play. But the whole thing is text-based, so it is actually a text you're exploring. If you ever come across House of Leaves, the Mark Danielewski thing, which is a entirely physical, not electronic text from, I think, the 80s or 90s, it's kind of similar to that. So you're navigating something not just vertically down a page, and it is not linear, but at the same time it is one solid text you explore. The consequences and outcomes don't change significantly as you go through, but the process of exploring it is much more challenging and in some senses richer than exploring a normal linear codex.
So with that as context, let's watch some of this non-vertical presentation and just pretend your telephone or your television was your telephone or an iPad or other kind of tablet, and you could change the direction of it when the text changed. Check it out.
Is the key. A framed number in the room where red meets yellow in a frame. Plus another framed number between hope and lies. Plus the channel I am on.
All right. So is there an audience for this?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, they're a terrific developer, and I'm really happy because they had a much more traditional game that was previous called Beat Street Bandit. And, you know, it's always how much are people going to engage with interactive fiction? So that a developer that's been this successful in the App Store would do this is great to me.
And is it legitimate fiction and a legitimate game at the same time? I could see where somebody who's used to reading traditional books might have fun with this, but they might dismiss the writing as, oh my goodness, this is all about design and interactivity, so it really can't be the great American novel.
Well, you know, I feel like a lot of times that's one of the great spots here because I think it can really surprise people. I think a lot of these, as people play more in the space, I mean, Device 6 is I think, a pretty good story, and I feel like people are often really surprised. They get it for their phone because they think it's fun and has some bells and whistles and they can kind of play around with it. And usually they end up more engaged in the story than they expect it to be. So that's kind of the perfect thing for me. And I feel like as more people play in the space, the better stories we see.
Are there other authors, Alexis, that people might have heard of from other contexts doing this now, or is it developing basically its own generation of designers slash authors for this?
There are. I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind that the digital thing is new, but there's a long tradition of authors incorporating design and unusual procedural writing into their work. So people like William Blake obviously included design in his work, and that's integral to the experience of it. Alistair Gray, people like the Oulipo novelist, Georges Perec, Raymond Queneau, those people all built procedural works, things like 100,000 billion poems, which you sliced up a poem and registered in random order. These aren't new things, they've always been experimental
And
things.
tell us about the thing that you're working on with Random House, Black Crown.
Black Crown. So Black Crown, I think, what makes it special and really where I think digital literature works best is that Rob Sherman, the writer, came to Random House with an unusual project that wouldn't really fit in a novel. And he tried to wrestle it into a linear text and it didn't work. But his prose was so rich and the idea was so exciting that Random House wanted to do something with it. They came to us because they'd worked with us before on a digital project to promote a traditional piece of fiction. And what Rob has produced with us and Random House in Black Crown is this narrative where the process of engagement and of complicity is part of the narrative, and where you make sense of it by exposing yourself to some of the elements of the narrative that are most disturbing or most interesting, or provoke a particular personal response. But Rob has written linear fiction as well. He's done some novellas that Random House have published. And you do find authors who dabble on both sides of the boundary. Naomi Alderman in this country is quite a well-known literary authoress, and also has done a lot of gaming and digital literature work.
All right.
But they are, it's kind of like being bilingual.
And
There's
John,
a couple-
you've got best-selling author Kelly Armstrong at Penguin, right?
Yeah, so you'd mentioned Inkle. That's a developer we've worked with a few times. They have a program on the web called Inkle Writer that anyone can use without any programming experience to write an interactive story. I'd seen that. We'd worked with them on another app. And Kelly Armstrong is a very successful author for us. She's done a long-running series called The Women of the Other World. She was starting a new series, and we were like, hey, I knew she had been a computer programmer back in the day, so we could try her out on this. She was pretty eager and did a great job of writing an interactive story. We turned it into what we call a visual novel. So as we said, there's a big spectrum. So that's where it's an interactive story, kind of like a choose your own adventure book, but it has on screen full animation, music, sound to kind of illustrate it.
You've got another vocabulary word for us, I understand, which is skeuomorphism.
Well, so that's a term that you hear a lot when they talk about if you want to have an app that has a user interface, so that's what you sort of the look and feel of the app, and they try and make it look like a real world item. So it's interesting in reference to Inkle, there's a company called Tin Man Games who made a lot of game books that really imitate kind of the look and feel of reading a book. And then Inkle sort of took an opposite approach with some of the same kind of storytelling. Steve Jackson wrote a lot of these books back in the day. Tin Man Games did that kind of skeuomorphic approach. And Inkle did kind of a new take with their Sorcery and Sorcery 2 games, where it's much more taking advantage of the iPad interface. So it's kind of playing with, are people going to be comfortable with something that looks like a book, or do they want to kind of explore a little more?
So is this also where people access these games/books if they want to read them, or when you talk about Inkle Writer, or when he's got Story Nexus from Failbetter, are these the places where people write and develop these things, or this is also where the readers, players go?
It depends. So for Story Nexus, I mean, Alexis should correct me, but I think it's got like a real nexus of users who go there and comment on each other's stories and encourage each other to keep going. That would be right, Alexis, right?
Alexis, want to talk about that?
So Story Nexus, like Inkle Writer, is a web-based tool for creating stories, interactive stories online and sharing them. People dip in, generate little stories, or in some cases quite grand arcs, and then share them, and then it's possible to monetize them. And then we take a cut of the revenue because we host the technology involved. But it's really a creative community, and people are experimenting and sharing with small numbers of friends. So Story Nexus hasn't produced anything that I think I describe as mass market literature. I'm not really expecting it to, but what it is a community of people engaging in creative activity on their own terms. I think one of the things I want to say about Inkle, who are really one of the most interesting companies in this space, is that John Ingold, who runs Inkle, has a long tradition in interactive fiction, traditional interactive fiction, going back to the Infocom style games of the 80s. And I think the same craft and the same terminology and approaches come through again and again with each generation. What makes a difference this time round is that because these things live on mobile devices and on the web, people have affordances and approaches that they immediately understand. And things like device 6, you can touch, see an effect, touch, see another effect, and it's much less confusing for the uninitiated.
So John, any career advice for young people coming up who may be interested in writing, but they're also as steeped in games as they are in reading, and they want to get into this?
I mean, I think that that's one of the great things is there's a lot of places now where they can go. So Inkle Writer, you don't need any programming experience. You can go and do that. I think anybody can also learn to write an app. I mean, not super easily these days, but certainly much more than they could, and get it on the Apple App Store. I think it costs $99 to become an Apple developer. So I think that if you can learn to write an app, and if you can also learn to write a story, then you are set to go.
Does it imply a new kind of literacy, or maybe it's not that new anymore, but when we say the word literacy, we're talking about reading in the traditional sense. Usually, there are two kinds of literacy that you probably need to have to be a good developer or author in this realm.
Well, I feel like literacy means a lot of different things when you talk about, I mean, I was just reading a great article about Twitter and how Twitter is really a writing tool. So I feel like this is just another writing tool. And I think the difference is the game aspect, where playing with that interactivity, you can write a book and show it to a few people and they'll have comments. With a game, you really need people to play through and really have a lot of feedback. because what you're really trying to do is put someone else into that world. And so their experience of it is even more important than with a story. But I think that what's great about interactive fiction, what attracts me, I'm sure what attracts Alexis and John Ingold at Inkle, is the idea that it's so writing focused. It's a melding of the two.
So the book is more in your imagination than a regular traditional book would be.
Well, and even more so, you have more agency than you would in a traditional book. You can kind of feel like that experience is sort of unique to yourself.
So Alexis, how far off is the first Man Booker Prize or Nobel Prize for Literature for something in this genre? And do you need something like that to give it the legitimacy that it requires to really flourish?
I don't think so. I'd be surprised if a piece of interactive fiction won the Man Booker Prize anytime soon. I think it's always going to be a niche thing pursued by creative artists who particularly feel the need to express themselves in that way. And it'll do fine as that. There'll be an audience for it, there'll be people who want to create it and people who want to consume it. But I don't think it is the second coming of literature. I don't think all literature in 10 years' time is going to be interactive. I think it's always going to be the experimental border.
I'm not sure I 100% agree with that. I would say that I feel like it's not the second coming of literature. I don't think it's going to displace anything, but it's the same as when people ask me about ebooks versus print. I don't think that ebooks necessarily displace print. I don't think we have the breakthrough product here yet, but I'd say the award in this space right now is if you get featured on the App Store. So something like Kelly Armstrong's Cainesville Files getting featured, or Inkle's Sorcery Games. That's kind of an award, and it means that it's getting to reach a mass market audience. We maybe haven't had that mass market hit, but we've had sort of tastemakers say, pay attention to this, it's growing and it's coming.
Fascinating always to see new forms of creativity and the technology that enables them. Thank you very much. And that's our program for this week. We present a new program every week at this hour, and tune into my daily radio program, 10 a.m. to noon weekdays on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow, a special edition, 3 questions about the Bloomberg years. Did he make you healthier? Did he secure your city's future? And did he price you out? I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.